pilot that earns an instrument rating is a pilot that has mastered his flight skills to a level of precision and accuracy needed to safely fly an airplane through clouds, fog, and other adverse weather conditions. While flying in these conditions known as Instrument Meteorological Conditions, or IMC, a pilot is tasked with flying an airplane solely by reference to flight instruments. In other words, the pilot needs to be able to go from takeoff to landing without having any outside visual references. Perhaps the most critical phase of an instrument flight is the instrument approach. This is the final phase of the flight when the pilot transitions from IMC flight to a visual landing after maneuvering the aircraft throughout the national airspace system. On this episode of UND Aerospace's AeroCast, we will discuss the procedures and techniques used in the Cessna 172 to fly an approach that offers only horizontal navigation guidance, commonly referred to as a non-precision instrument approach. Reviewing this information along with the training of an FAA-certified instrument flight instructor will help to refine your instrument skills and make you more organized and comfortable during your next instrument flight. Of course, you should not attempt a flight in IMC unless you are a proficient instrument-rated pilot that meets the recency requirements of FAR Part 61, or you are under the direct supervision of an FAA-certified instrument flight instructor. The objective of a non-precision instrument approach is to achieve the skill and knowledge necessary to transition from the en route phase of the instrument approach and then to a landing using only horizontal guidance. In this video, the airplane will be flown from cruise flight to a point where a safe visual landing can be made using only the horizontal guidance provided by a VOR, NDB, LDA, SDF, localizer back course, GPS, or airport surveillance radar. As a pilot approaches her destination airport, she must select the most appropriate instrument approach procedure. A decision will be based on many criteria, including current weather conditions, navigation equipment available both at the airport and in the airplane, and air traffic control requirements or requests. Once the pilot has determined which procedure she will fly, it is important that they select, tune, identify, and confirm the operational status of the navigation equipment to be used. Once this is complete, the pilot should set the proper course with the Omni bearing selector, or in the case of an ASR approach, fly the assigned headings and altitudes. It is important to note that in many technologically advanced aircraft, such as UND's Garmin 1000 equipped Cessna 172s, the avionics will automatically select the proper OBS course when conducting certain types of approaches. However, it is still important that the pilot confirms that the correct navigation source and OBS course has been set. Once the approach procedure has been selected and the pilot has begun to set up the aircraft's avionics, she must be sure to establish the appropriate airplane configuration and airspeed prior to executing the approach procedure. In the Cessna 172, the pilot should fly at an airspeed of 100 knots while executing any required procedure turn or while flying ATC-assigned radar vectors. While changing airspeeds, however, it is important that the pilot complies with any clearances or instructions issued by air traffic control. Prior to arriving at the initial approach fix, or if receiving radar vectors prior to intercepting the final approach course, the pilot should complete the descent checklist. In UND's Cessna 172, this checklist includes the following items: GPS, flight plan entered and instrument approach loaded. Navcom 1, set the approach control, if available, and set the tower CTAF frequency in standby. Navcom 2, set ATIS frequency in use and set ground control frequency in standby. Audio panel, adjust volume level and squelch for both left and right seat. Select either COM1 or COM2. Ensure all other audio buttons are not selected. Altimeters. Set baro on PFD and the standby altimeter. CDI soft key. Select nav source. Note that the course deviation indicator will change color and appearance based upon which nav source is being used. The needle will be magenta when using GPS navigation, a single green line when using Nav 1, and a double green line when Nav 2 is selected. Pitot heat. Select pitot heat on if descending through visible moisture. Aircraft lights. Pulse light on at the top of descent. Mixture. Adjust for smooth engine operation, as necessary to make the engine run smoothly. Descent power. Adjust power to desired RPM setting and rate of descent. Engine instruments. Monitor oil pressure, oil temperature, ammeter, and vacuum. Fuel selector. Both. Approach briefing. Complete. Each one of these items is necessary in order to conduct a safe instrument approach. The approach briefing, however, is notably important as it allows the pilot to familiarize him or herself and the other crew members with the instrument approach procedure to be used. The approach briefing should contain the following items: type of approach, primary nav aid, frequency, identifier, final approach course, minimum altitude at final approach fix, lowest applicable minimum descent altitude, airport elevation and touchdown zone elevation, missed approach point, missed approach instructions, applicable approach procedure notes, indicated airspeed and flap configuration to be flown, landing runway, and runway length.
Today we're going to be doing the RNAV GPS runway 35 left approach at Grand Forks. Our nav aid frequency, it is the GPS. We have that set in. Our final approach course is 354. Our altitude we're going to be at, we're being vectored right now. Once we're established and cleared for the approach, we can go down to 2600 until we reach Jagby. After we cross Jagby, we can go down to our MDA, which is 1095 and a half mile visibility. Our touchdown zone elevation for this approach is 845. Our runway length is 7,351 feet. The landing distance is about 585 feet today. Airspeed is going to be 90 knots. Our flap setting is going to be 10 knots. Our missed approach point will be the GPS will let us know, plus the runway 35 left. Our missed approach instructions are climb to 2600, direct to FODIB and hold. Have any questions?
Remember that the UND Aerospace takeoff and landing distance card, or TOLD card, should be used when conducting the approach briefing. It contains all of the required items that must be included in this briefing. The pilot should use the approach briefing to physically prepare the cockpit by setting the avionics and organizing approach charts. In addition, the approach briefing should be used to help the pilot mentally prepare for the approach. The pilot should be aware of all the factors that will lead to the successful completion of the approach. At what altitude will she break out of the clouds? Where will she be in relation to the runway while on the final approach course? What type of runway lighting and approach lighting system will be in use at the airport? Will the reported weather conditions permit for a successful transition to a landing? These types of questions should all be addressed in the approach briefing. Whether receiving radar vectors or flying a full procedure instrument approach, the pilot will eventually receive an approach clearance from ATC. Here's an example of what a pilot will hear when being given radar vectors to an instrument approach.
29er, turn right heading 300, maintain 3000 till established on the final approach course. Cleared VOR, runway 35 left approach.
An aircraft that flies a full approach procedure without the assistance of radar vectors will usually get a shorter clearance.
29er, cleared VOR, runway 35 left approach.
This clearance is more concise because the pilot will be expected to follow the published approach procedure to join the final approach course. She will not receive a heading and altitude to fly from air traffic control. The pilot will sometimes be requested to report when established on the final approach course. After becoming established on the final approach course, the pilot will be granted a frequency change by ATC. This will either be a change to the control tower frequency or to a common traffic advisory frequency. Regardless, the pilot should promptly contact the new frequency to state her intentions. In the case of an airport without an operating control tower, the pilot must communicate with any other aircraft in the vicinity to ensure aircraft separation throughout the approach.
Exit area traffic, Sioux 73, 5 miles on the final approach course for the VOR runway 31. Full stop, Crookston.
As the pilot continues the approach procedure and nears the final approach fix, she should execute the before landing checklist. The checklist prepares the aircraft and its occupants for landing. It should be initiated prior to reaching the final approach fix. This checklist contains the following items: pilot and passenger seatbacks, most upright position. Seats and seatbelts, secured and locked. Fuel selector, both. Mixture, set for the best performance during landing, rich or as appropriate for density altitude. Cabin power 12-volt switch, off. Aircraft lights, for day, pulse light on. At night, taxi and landing lights on, pulse light selected off. When the aircraft is 2 nautical miles from the final approach fix, the pilot should establish the approach configuration and airspeed. If the approach does not have a specific final approach fix, the pilot should establish this configuration upon commencing a descent to the minimum descent altitude. In the Cessna 172, the pilot should select 10 degrees of flaps and fly the aircraft at 90 knots. Now that the pilot and the aircraft are both prepared for the approach, the pilot may continue tracking the final approach course. As always, it's important to comply with any ATC-issued instructions or restrictions. As the aircraft proceeds along the approach, the pilot must carefully track the final approach course. In the case of most non-precision approaches, the final approach course actually gets narrower as the aircraft flies closer to the airport. This means that the pilot should identify any course deviations and correct for them promptly. But remember, because the course becomes narrower, a heading correction of only a few degrees will quickly get the aircraft back on course. Because the width of the final approach course gets smaller, the course deviation indicator will appear to be more sensitive. While the sensitivity actually remains the same, except for in the case of a GPS approach, the needle is more likely to show even the slightest deviation from course. Again, make a heading correction of only a few degrees to re-intercept the proper course and continue inbound towards the airport. While most non-precision approaches utilize on-airport nav aids such as a VOR or NDB, there are some approaches that use a nav aid that is not located at the airport. An example of this can be found in Spokane, Washington. On this approach, the pilot navigates to the Spokane VOR and then continues the procedure by flying from the VOR. A pilot must be aware of the location of the nav aid she is using to prevent confusion and anticipate any errors that might occur during the approach, such as crossing the cone of confusion over a VOR. To enhance situational awareness, the UND Aerospace Standardization Manual requires that several callouts be made during the entire approach profile. Upon arrival at a half nautical mile from the final approach fix, the pilot flying shall call out flaps 10 before landing to the line complete. Upon crossing the final approach fix, the pilot flying will call before landing below the line complete and will start her initial descent to land. At 1,000 feet above the touchdown zone elevation, the pilot flying will call out altimeters and instruments cross-checked. As the descent progresses, the pilot will anticipate reaching the MDA, and at 100 feet above the MDA, will call out 100 to minimums. Upon reaching the MDA, the pilot flying will call out minimums. The pilot flying will then, upon reaching the visual descent point, call out VDP, runway in sight, 12 o'clock, landing, or approach lights in sight, continuing. As the aircraft continues the descent to the runway of intended landing, the pilot flying will call out no flags, clear to land, once the aircraft reaches 500 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. If, after reaching the MDA, the pilot fails to meet the requirements necessary to descend from the MDA, she will continue at the MDA to the missed approach point where she will call out, no contact, go around, and execute the missed approach procedure. As the aircraft approaches the minimum descent altitude, or MDA, she must begin to transition from a descent to level flight. In doing so, it will be necessary to adjust the throttle and elevator trim to maintain a constant altitude and airspeed. The pilot, now flying at the MDA, should reference the charted visual descent point if one exists. The VDP is a point from which a pilot can make a stabilized 3-degree glide path approach from the MDA to a landing. If there is no charted VDP, the pilot can calculate one as follows. Simply determine the minimum descent height, which will be an AGL altitude, and then divide by 300. The number 300 is used because 300 feet per nautical mile is a 3-degree glide path. For example, if the MDH is 600 feet, divide 600 by 300, and your VDP is 2 nautical miles from the end of the runway. Let's take a look at an example. Using the Rochester VOR runway 2 approach, you can see that the minimum descent height for an aircraft with DME is 363 feet. Because 363 feet divided by 300 equals approximately 1.2, we have determined that the visual descent point is 1.2 nautical miles from the end of the runway. As listed on the approach plate, the runway end is located at 7.8 nautical miles from the Rochester VOR. As a result, the VDP is located 6.6 miles or 6.6 DME from the Rochester VOR. As the aircraft arrives at the visual descent point, the pilot will either call out runway in sight, 12 o'clock, landing, and then transition to a stabilized approach and landing, or the pilot will continue flying at the minimum descent altitude until reaching the missed approach point. Remember that the pilot may only descend below the MDA if he or she meets the following criteria. Runway environment is visible, visibility requirements are met, and the aircraft is in a position to make a normal descent and landing. These requirements are listed in the UND Cessna 172 Standardization Manual and are required by FAR 91.175. You can check out all these resources for more information. Once the pilot has met the listed criteria, she should reduce the airspeed below 85 knots and set the flaps to full. The pilot should maintain visual contact with the runway environment and fly a stabilized approach until touchdown.
Now half a mile from the VOR, runway is still not in sight, maintaining 1220 and 90 knots.
If visual contact with the runway is not established, or if the pilot fails to meet the requirements listed in 91.175, a missed approach procedure must be executed prior to or at the published missed approach point. A missed approach procedure can be considered the IFR version of a go-around or aborted landing, where the pilot will depart the airport and fly a specified route, course, or heading, typically arriving in a holding pattern. If a missed approach must be executed, the pilot should call out no contact, go around, once the decision to execute the missed approach procedure has been made.
And point 3, missed approach.
The pilot will smoothly apply power and establish a climb attitude. Once the aircraft achieves a positive rate of climb, the pilot should call out positive rate and retract the flaps if extended.
Positive rate?
At this time, the pilot must advise air traffic control of the missed approach and of their intentions.
Rough Tower, Sioux 73, missed approach.
For your instrument check ride, the instrument rating PTS requires that the applicant exhibits adequate knowledge of the elements related to an instrument approach procedure, selects and complies with the appropriate instrument approach procedure to be performed, establishes two-way communications with ATC as appropriate to the phase of flight or approach segment, and uses proper communication phraseology and technique, selects tunes, identifies, and confirms the operational status of navigation equipment to be used for the approach procedure. Complies with all clearances issued by ATC or the examiner. Recognizes if any flight instrumentation is inaccurate or inoperative and takes appropriate action. Advises ATC or examiner any time that the aircraft is unable to comply with a clearance. Establishes the appropriate aircraft configuration and airspeed considering turbulence and wind shear, and completes the aircraft checklist items appropriate to the phase of the flight. Maintains, prior to beginning the final approach segment, altitude within plus or minus 100 feet, heading within plus or minus 10 degrees, and allows less than a 3/4 scale deflection of the CDI or within plus or minus 10 degrees in the case of an RMI, and maintains airspeed within plus or minus 10 knots. Applies the necessary adjustments to the published MDA and visibility criteria for the aircraft approach category when required, such as NOTAMs, inoperative aircraft and ground navigation equipment, inoperative visual aids associated with the landing environment, NWS reporting factors and criteria. Establishes a rate of descent and track that will ensure arrival at the MDA prior to reaching the missed approach point, with the aircraft continuously in a position from which descent to a landing on the intended runway can be made at a normal rate using normal maneuvers. Allows, while on the final approach segment, no more than a 3/4 scale deflection of the CDI or within 10 degrees in the case of an RMI, and maintains airspeed within plus or minus 10 knots of that desired. Maintains the MDA, when reached, within plus 100 feet, minus 0 feet, all the way to the missed approach point. Executes the missed approach procedure when the required visual references for the intended runway are not distinctly visible and identifiable at the missed approach point. Executes a normal landing from a straight-in or circling approach when instructed by the examiner. As your instrument training progresses, you will likely be faced with many challenging scenarios requiring non-precision approach procedures. These approaches will be conducted at various airports utilizing multiple types of navigation aids and in many different weather conditions. Together with your UND flight instructor, practice these non-precision approaches using different navigation aids and different techniques such as course reversals, procedure turns, and radar vectors. Take advantage of the opportunity to practice these approaches during your flight training so that after you earn an instrument rating, you are well prepared and can confidently transition from the en route phase of flight all the way to a safe landing using a non-precision instrument approach. As always, we on the UND AeroCast staff hope you've enjoyed this latest episode. Please have fun and fly safe.